This is Mo Volans for Mastering the Mix, and in this series of videos we're going to be taking a look at various mixing and mastering techniques that should help you improve your overall sound. In this video I want to take a look at a typical in-the-box mastering session, but more specifically the low frequencies. I'll go through every stage of the mastering chain, showing you how to keep those lows in check, and then we'll use BASSROOM from Mastering the Mix to extend and enhance those lows. So let's take a look at the session and get into it. So here we are in our mastering project, and we're in Logic just for the sake of clarity. Over to the left here you can see the plugins that I'm using in our mastering chain. I've tried to group them as best I can, so we start with a bus compressor. We've got 3 different EQs, you'll see why later. And then we've got our enhancement plugins, BASSROOM from Mastering the Mix and Stage 1. And then we've got a limiter, and we've got some utilities at the bottom, just some metering and SonarWorks that I use when monitoring through my studio monitors. Now I'm going to play you back some of the track just so you can get a feel for what we're working with everything bypassed apart from a small amount of limiting, just to get it up to level for the video. So as you can hear, the mix is pretty tight and there's not really any inherent problems. But there is some work to be done on the low end, and I feel like the whole thing could be a little wider and brighter and more impressive. That's just something that works for this genre. So what we're going to do is take a look at every stage, as promised in the introduction, and see how we can handle low end especially, and see how we can make sure that our low frequencies and subsonics are behaving themselves before we enhance them. So I always start off with a bus compressor generally, unless I'm going to be treating with some tape or saturation, but here we've got the SPL iron. Now the beauty of this compressor is there's so many options, and some of those are directly related to handling low frequencies. In the lower section here we've got a high-pass sidechain filter. Now what this will do is filter out any low frequencies that hit the detection circuit of the compressor. We don't really want too many low frequencies hitting that detection circuit because they will trigger the gain reduction and trigger the amount of compression being applied, and you'll get artifacts that you really don't want, like pumping and sucking effects, and we just don't want these in mastering. We want something a little more predictable and something we can handle all the way through the chain. So if we put the high-pass sidechain filter to about 130 or thereabouts, we're going to ensure that none of our super low mids, low frequencies or subsonics are triggering the compression circuit. We can also use the mono maker here. So that means that anything below about 80 Hz is going to be summed to mono, and that will give us extra control. So these two things together should give us the results we want. Let's take a listen. Great, that's giving us a nice cohesive sound. It's controlling wayward transients, but the low end isn't creating any problems, and that's really what we want. It's a subtle change here, but of course we're mastering here, so all we want are several subtle changes. We can now move on to the EQ section. So here's BX Digital version 3 from Brainworks. It's always in my mastering chain, and it probably always will be until version 4 comes out. But again, what's useful here is the mono maker. Now we've already used this in the previous plugin, and it's the same technology, both being from Brainworks developers. But you can see that around 80 to 100 Hz works really well here, summing those low frequencies to mono and adding that extra control that we need. We've also got a nice stereo width control here, which essentially raises the side or stereo section that we're working with in this plugin. And also there's a really useful mono section here with a high-pass filter. There's a high-pass filter on both sides. Sometimes you can put the high-pass filter on the stereo section if you like, if you want to control that. And the mono section we can high-pass to 25, say, just to ensure that there's not super subsonics in our signal. And also we can enhance the low end in the mono section using the bass shift. This is really nice because you're only really hitting your kick drum and the mono section of your bass, and you're not adding any low frequencies to stereo information or instruments that just don't need it. Our next EQ is the Elysia Music or MusicQ, depending on how you want to pronounce it. This really hasn't got anything to do with low end. We're only really enhancing high frequencies and high mids, as you can see in these two bands, just to sweeten things. And finally, in our EQ section, we've got a simple FabFilter Pro Q3 in linear phase mode. And it's again just filtering low frequencies. Now, I know we did this in the BX Digital version 3. This is just to show you a different way of doing it. But what you may find is that cascading similar processes like this actually works very well because they've got different curves. And you may introduce some low frequencies doing something else somewhere in your chain. And you might need another high pass further down the chain just to ensure that they've not crept back into the mix. So let's take a listen with and without all of these in place. So we're adding some real clarity here, but also at the same time ensuring our low frequencies are totally under control. At this point, I'm happy to move on to enhancement. So the first enhancer in our chain, and the first one I'd like to look at, is the excellent BASSROOM for mastering the mix. Now, BASSROOM for me is a really great all-in-one solution for dealing with your low end. It's excellent for both attenuation and enhancement and allows you to access several musically pre-selected bands at once. Now, as you can see, I've already got some settings dialed in here. These are the ones I'm using for this track, but there are actually 3 ways we can decide on the final settings we use in BASSROOM. The first 2 ways involve what are called targets. So there are 2 ways we can set our targets, and the first way is by simply pressing this target icon down in the bottom left-hand side of the plugin. You'll then get this drop files dialog, and I'm going to grab a file from my desktop. Now you can see it here, I've just named it reference for copyright purposes, but I'm going to drop it in here. You'll get a very short wait while it processes, and then you can select an area. And then we can hit create targets. And then you can actually close this area down. Now you can add more than one reference, and if you do that, and BASSROOM will generate targets based on all of the references you choose to analyze. You can now see these lines down the side, and these are our references without playback. But if I play the track back, you'll see these change in real time. Now we can see that they've fallen right back in the subs, and they've come right forward in the higher bass frequencies, and this is because the reference track obviously had less of these frequencies. So if we want to match it, we can simply copy these and this will bring us closer to our reference track. Now, of course, this is just a starting point, and you can actually just use this as a guide and then fine-tune to taste. If you'd prefer to use a method without using files, you can use the preset references. Star Engineers and Dance Pop Guru is always a good start with tracks like this, and this will give you a very different reference and a different signature. For this track, I'm going to turn off the guidance system. I'm not going to use any targets, and I'm going to set it exactly how I want. And of course, this is a perfectly acceptable way of using BASSROOM. If you're pretty experienced and you know the sound you're after, you don't have to use the targets. So I've added about a dB to every subsonic band, and I've not added anything in the higher bass frequencies because I felt there was enough there. Let's take a listen to what I've done, and I'll bypass the effect as well. So to me, it's a nice subtle change. It's not overbearing and it's not hyped, but I've added that low frequency information that I was really missing in my mix. Next up, we've got another one of my staple plugins, which is Leapwing Audio's Stage 1. And I really love the width section here. I like to dial this way up, into like the 50s or the 40s and make sure that this high pass is in place. And again, this is some low end management. We're really making sure that none of these low frequencies are enhanced or widened. We don't want any stereo enhancement happening down there. That's why we added the mono maker earlier, and we don't really want to undo any of that work at this stage. So let's take a listen to Stage 1 in its current state, active and bypassed. So you can hear, it's another really subtle change, but it adds some real magic to the mix. It's subtle enough so that it's not intrusive, it's mono-compatible, and in my mind it's probably one of the most tasteful ways of enhancing your stereo information on the master bus. So I'm really happy with the way this master's turned out. I think we've done a good job of managing the low frequencies and enhancing them simultaneously, and by the time we hit our limiter, everything was firing on all cylinders. So hopefully this has been useful to you, and I'll catch you next time.